and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the albums by 90s Brit rock legends Oasis. Oasis formed in Manchester in 1991, famously by singing brother Liam and guitar and songwriting brother Noel Gallagher. They formed the band with Bonehead, who's otherwise known as Paul Arthurs, the guitarist, Paul McGuigan on bass and Tony McCarroll on drums, and along the way there were a few lineup changes that we'll talk about. Spotted by Creation Records' Alan McGee when they played at King Tut's in Glasgow, McGee eventually signed them to his Creation label in 1993, and they went on to become by far and away the biggest English rock band of the 90s, and alongside the Spice Girls, I think probably one of the biggest defining cultural events of that decade as well. This month, the Oasis at Nebworth film comes out in the cinemas, and I remember only too well what a huge event that was at the time. I was playing in a young Britpop band myself, and it really did feel for 3 incredible years that Oasis kind of ruled the world. They were going to meet the Prime Minister and all kinds of things like that. Alongside Blur, they gave us that feeling that pop music really mattered again. Blur versus Oasis, it was real reminiscent of the Beatles versus the Stones again. And as I've said before, I think although Blur possibly won the odd battle, there's no question that Oasis won the war. And now, certainly in this country, they are ranked up there alongside the British rock greats. Noel Gallagher himself, I think, is one of these sort of revered elder statesmen of rock music, and I always enjoy listening to him speak. I think he's candid, smart, funny. He's always interesting. The band released 8 albums of studio material. They actually released 7 albums and then also an album of B-sides, which I'm going to include on this list because I think it's important. And, some of their songs have gone on to become part of the sort of British social landscape in the way that only songs by perhaps the Beatles and Queen and maybe the Stones have done. But look, let's crack on with it and see where we end up. At number 8, I'm going to put their final studio album from 2008, Dig Out Your Soul. The band's last album, and look, it's not a bad record, and the first half I think is actually fairly enjoyable, but you've got Bag It Up, Shock of the Lightning, which was the first single from this album. Noel claims he was focusing more on grooves on this album than songs, and that sort of bears out. It's pretty solid Oasis fare, but I think it does run out of steam and tempo, and the vibe and the energy, they all sort of plummet on this record by the end. You can almost sort of feel Noel kind of itching to get out the door and start his solo career. By this time, Noel wasn't the only songwriter in the band. For a few albums now, Liam had been contributing, as had Andy Bell and Jem Archer, 2 of the newer members. Zach Starkey, Ringo Starr's son, plays drums on this album, as he had also been doing for a couple of records. But the band did split up a year later after this, after some ludicrous vegetable fight or fruit fight on stage, I think. The reception to the album was fairly positive. People had been dying for another great Oasis album for some time, but I think they were definitely kidding themselves if they thought that this was anywhere near their best work. It sold well enough on both sides of the Atlantic, and in 2011 was voted the 207th best album of Q Magazine's lifetime, which I find extraordinary. But, there you go. Maybe it's just me. It often is. At number 7 from 2002, I'm going to put their 5th album, Heathen Chemistry. So after the sort of sonic diversion of Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, this was back to a sort of more classic Oasis sound. This was their first album with Andy Bell and Jem Archer, who had come in. And it's the first album where Noel doesn't completely dominate all the writing. And the reward for this is an album that carried a handful of hits. You've got the Hindu Times on here, which was their 6th UK number 1. Stop Crying Your Heart Out, the delightful sort of breezy She Is Love, and Liam's sweet Songbird. There are some nice songs on this album. There's a hidden track that comes in 30 minutes after the last song has finished. It's called The Cage. I'm not sure it's worth waiting 30 minutes for, but it's there if you didn't know already. The album wasn't greatly received when it came out. I think people thought it was a bit too sort of standard Oasis, but it did go 3 times platinum in the UK, and Oasis fever was still sky high, even if the songwriting mojo was clearly on the wane. At number 6, their 6th album from 2005, Don't Believe the Truth. Now, this was buoyed up by 3 big hits: The Importance of Being, Idol, Lila, and Let There Be Love. Liam claims it's his favourite of the later Oasis albums, and again, the songwriting has been shared out by this point, and it does sort of feel less of an old album. Recording was drawn out as drummer Alan White, who had replaced Tony McCarroll after the first album. He had left to be replaced by Zach Starkey, and originally the label couldn't hear a single on this album, so they had to go back and do another recording session where they came out with Lila. Really, the rest of the album, aside from the singles, is pretty unremarkable, and the filler on this album really kind of does feel like filler. When they were ploddy and stodgy, Oasis were very ploddy and stodgy. But it was UK #1 on release, triple platinum in its first week, and in some polls voted the 14th best British album of all time, which is just ludicrous. But I think it's a good sign of how popular and enormous Oasis were at the time. At number 5, their 4th album from 2000, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. By the turn of the millennium, the shine really seemed to have come off Oasis, I think. They were still hugely popular, but some people were tiring of their feuding antics, and they'd moved on to sort of maybe the safer, more saccharine sounds of Coldplay. It was definitely a time for change for the band, and they'd left Creation. They'd formed their own label, Big Brother Records. Bonehead and Grigsby, Paul McGuigan, had left the band, and now they were essentially just a trio. And Noel decided it was time for Oasis to start using loops and samples and synths and whatever else he could get to sort of sidestep people's expectations. The results: it's not a great album, and it really did feel at this point that Britpop was done, and that Oasis couldn't ride those coattails anymore. They did need to find something new. And to be honest, despite the odd huge hit from here on in, it did feel like Oasis was more of a kind of feuding brother sideshow than a really relevant, musical ongoing concern. But this album does open with the sort of fairly thrilling Led Zepp-like Effing in the Bushes. And there are some good moments. Go Let It Out, Sunday Morning Call. But it's clear the songwriting dystrophy was now kicking in. The classics just didn't seem to be coming as easy to Noel as they did before. And some of this is just a noisy slog. Maybe we were just all growing up. I don't know. But, that was something I think that was a problem from here on in with their albums. But it was still the 16th fastest selling album in UK history and sold 280,000 copies in the US. But artistically, this was definitely the point where the band was standing on the shoulders of its own reputation. See what I did there? At number 4, their 3rd album from 1997, Be Here Now. I remember the weight of expectation on this album because they'd previously done What's the Story, Morning Glory, and by the time this album was coming out, Oasis were a cultural giant, and they, as a band, they were indulging in all the booze, drugs, and wild behaviour that comes with that kind of acclaim. And this album is a big, bloated, sprawling thing. And, I do actually think there is a pretty good album in here somewhere if you could just sort of chip away at it and edit some of it. Liam was never the greatest singer in the world, but he has so much swagger. And he carries that swagger all the way through this album. And, love him and his brother or not, you have to admit that they just have bags and bags of stage presence and charisma. And like I say, I think it's Liam's charisma that carries this record. Do you know what I mean? Stand By Me, All Around the World. These songs are okay. They're definitely not as sharp and less focused as some of the great songs we've had before. And in some ways, the whole album is a little bit more predictable and less exciting. It all feels a little bit contrived, not least the album cover itself, which seems to be just trying far too hard to be interesting. But yeah, like I said, the album was so highly anticipated, but artistically I think it was overshadowed by Radiohead's OK Computer, and they sort of took over that mantle of the great guitar band of the time. Noel hates this album, but guess what? Liam loves it. So, what are you going to do? Some have called it the sort of bloated arse end of Britpop, but by the end of that, the first day of release, it had still sold 400,000 copies. That's by the end of the first day of release, making it the fastest selling album in UK chart history. Another good illustration of just how anticipated this record was. Since sold over 8 million copies. And, so it sounds to me like Britpop was still going pretty strong with the great British unwashed. Now at number 3, I am going to put from 1998 The Master Plan, and this is the aforementioned album of B-sides. It's often cited as one of the band's best releases, despite not being a studio album. And while definitely inconsistent, it certainly contains many of their best songs. You've got Acquiesce, Talk Tonight, the brilliant Half the World Away, rollicking live cover of the Beatles' I Am the Walrus. A lot of these songs we knew already from the singles, and they had been getting some radio play because people really, really liked them. And I think there was definitely an appetite to have them on an album, and we got that. And this is an album B-sides that went on to sell 3 million copies. Who makes an album of B-sides that sells 3 million copies? I think there's a sense of disappointment that Noel didn't just save some of these great songs and end up putting them on an Oasis album proper. But I think that just kind of then disregards the way Oasis, the story, and the way Oasis did things. I think the great B-sides was part of what made them so popular in the first place. So that takes us to the top 2, and as so often with these lists, there comes a point where I think we're into the really essential albums now, and I think the top 2, which I don't think any of you are going to be remotely surprised about, are the 2 albums that I think if you're new to Oasis, these are the 2 where you just have to start. There's nowhere else, and really the order of these could change, but I'm going to put in number 2 today from 1984 their debut album, Definitely Maybe. I think guitar music had been making a bit of a comeback by the late 80s. You had the Stone Roses in Spiral Carpets, the Blue Tones. But it wasn't really until Oasis arrived on the scene that it became unapologetically retro. You could argue Oasis were the first band to really truly just look back. They were not trying to reinvent the wheel at all. The only thing genuinely fresh in their fabric, I think, was the sort of 90s laddism and excitement that came with that. And also the band's offstage behaviour, and the music extolled all of this, really. Noel Gallagher was very quick to cite his influences. The Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, Weller, Burt Bacharach. He was a real student and fan of music, and that was obvious in the band's fat, boozed up, turned up to 11 kind of retro songs that borrowed chord changes liberally from all of those bands that I've mentioned. But the swagger and charisma that came with it, and I can't overstate those 2 things enough. I think they're so important in what made Oasis what they were. Along with the mood of the nation at the time, I think, it made them irresistible. And this album comes along with songs like Rock and Roll Star, Supersonic, Shaker Maker, Live Forever, Slide Away. I mean, it reads like a greatest hits, and they're only one album into their career. Produced by Owen Morris, who went on to do most of their albums, this really was the sound of a band just dive bombing into the swimming pool of music and irritating just as many people as they were entertaining. And within a year, all the guys, in England were sort of, dressing up like Liam and pretending to be from Manchester, and I think the album's legacy just casts quite a long, deep shadow. And I think along with Park Life, this was the last time that guitar-based music really, truly felt fresh, exciting, and relevant relevant and reflective of the culture, what was going on in culture at the time. And music is always the most exciting when it is the soundtrack to change, which was absolutely the case here with this album. So, as you probably guessed, that leaves us one album, and it's their second album from 1985. What's the Story? Morning Glory. So, with Oasis fever now at absolute boiling point, the whole nation seemed to know that if the band could deliver on their sophomore album, they would go stratospheric. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Fueled by the Blur singles war, which was Blur's Country Life versus Oasis's Roll With It, they were on the news. They were on the top of the news. They were in the papers. I mean, it was just everywhere. I can't tell you. Those of you who lived through it with me will know exactly what I'm talking about. And then, boosted by the evergreen Wonderwall, this was an album that just punched through the nation's zeitgeist like a wrecking ball and cemented the band's status forevermore. Famously recorded at Rockfield in Wales, where Bohemian Rhapsody was made. The album features, where do you begin? Wonderwall, Roll With It, Don't Look Back, In Anger, Champagne Supernova, the fabulous She's Electric. Some might say it's just another album chock full of classic British rock songs. Paul Weller features on the album on guitar and vocals on Champagne Supernova, and by all accounts, recording this album was a very, very relaxed, very happy process. The album's less boisterous, I think, than its predecessor. I think it's a little bit more thoughtful and reflective than Definitely Maybe. There's a new drummer in here, in Alan White. There are strings, there are acoustic guitars, and it certainly has more light and shade than Definitely Maybe. It has gone on to sell 22 million copies, and it has been named many times the greatest British album of all time. And in fact, at the 2010 Brit Awards, it was named the greatest British album of all time. 500 weeks on the UK album chart, the best-selling British album of the 90s. It is the very definition of a musical behemoth. And perhaps it is to British music of the 90s what Nirvana's Nevermind was to American music at the same time. So that's my Oasis list. As I say, the top two albums here are the essential ones. Aside from these albums, they've made some sort of pretty stodgy live albums. I don't think they were ever the most live and lean live band. But both Liam and Noel, they both have had successful solo careers, and they both continue to be sort of key figures in British culture, musically or otherwise. I suspect that if there's ever another Live Aid or Live 8 type concert, it will be Oasis we see reforming for charity. As I said at the top of the show, my relationship with Oasis now is largely about enjoying Noel's interviews, which I recommend, and there are many online you can listen to and enjoy. Before I go, I would just like to say thank you so much to everybody for helping me get to 1,000 subscribers. Yippee! I know that's not a great deal in the context of YouTube. I think PewDiePie has 110 million or something like that. Whoever PewDiePie is, I've never watched any of his shows. But when I started doing this, I remember thinking, if I get 100 subscribers that I can share music thoughts and ideas with, that's just lovely. And here I am with 1,000, so that's great. Thank you very much. Look, let me know your thoughts on Oasis, and let's see your lists below, and I'll be back soon for another Rock Records review. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.